Hello, my name is Mace Hall, and I have the privilege of interviewing Frank and Karen Boykin today on behalf of the One Lamb Ministry. Frank and Karen are members of Peachtree Road and have two adult children, and they're blessed with three grandchildren. Frank is retired now, but he had a career at Mohawk Industries and was the CFO there. And Karen had the really hard job and was a stay-at-home mother. She retired from that, and now she's back into full service duty, helping with those three grandchildren. Frank and Karen are blessing us today to talk about their story of addiction. Like all illnesses, they affect not just the person who is struggling, but also their family, from cancer to mental wellness to addiction. Everyone in the family is a part of that diagnosis and treatment and care of the person. And so we really appreciate your being willing to talk about your son, Stephen, and his battle with addiction. So I guess I want to start off and say, how did this start for Stephen?
Well, thank you, Mason. It's good to be here today. So Stephen and his oldest sister, Lauren, our daughter, grew up in the church. In fact, we taught confirmation class for both Stephen and Lauren, so 5 years of 12-year-olds. But they grew up in the church, and Stephen, by all accounts, had a perfectly normal life. Really through most of high school. He played sports and did reasonably well academically, and got into trouble like most kids do, but, not anything that was really unusual. And as we learned later, when he told us about his addiction in 2010, when he was in college, and home for the Christmas break, he actually had his first experience with opioids when he was in middle school playing football, and he broke his leg. And he went to CHOA, and they did what they needed to do there, and then they gave him Oxycontin. And at the time, we didn't really understand what we do today about opioids. And, when you ask Stephen today, how did he get started, I think he would say that it was that first experience. As we've learned, people that are addicts, has a genetic component to it. And for some people, there are just triggers for certain drugs or alcohol. And I think that experience flipped that trigger for him. And he would tell you that when he describes the feeling that he had when he was in the bed, the hospital bed, and he took that medication, you can tell, it's something that it was just, he's going to crave for the rest of his life. But at the time, we had no idea. And then he ended up in college, and one thing led to the other. He went from pills to snorting pills to ultimately to heroin. I think that's about the time when we learned about it, when he was in college.
So he was 13 or 14 years old? I mean, he's really young, it sounds like.
He was 13 or 14 when he broke his leg, and he had to be homeschooled. He broke his leg at the growth plate, so he couldn't move that leg. It was very serious. And I remember trying to maybe break the pill in half. And he was just in so much pain that, I would have to give him more. And we didn't realize that he was getting in our medicine cabinet, the medicine cabinets of his friends. It was in everybody's home. I remember I had dental work and they gave me Oxycontin. For me, I just hated the way I felt with it, but for Stephen, as he said, it was like this warmth just going through his body, and he felt a relaxation, a calmness that he never experienced in his life, and he loved the way he felt. And so I didn't realize I had to protect that medicine. I didn't understand it at the time, and this was probably around 2000. So we really hadn't heard much about OxyContin at the time. And anyway, when he told us on December 18th, 2010, when he said he was addicted to OxyContin, I thought that's not really that big a deal. I had no idea that basically it's synthetic heroin that so many of us were taking and our doctors had prescribed. And once he was in college, he could no longer have access to the medicine cabinet. And it doesn't take long to Google, what is OxyContin? And he could afford heroin. It was less expensive than pot. So he started on that journey with heroin, and he kind of hid that from us for a few months that he had become addicted to heroin.
So, as you said, he had it sounds like the childhood that we're trying to provide all of us here at the church. Mom and dad are volunteering, involved. I mean, just idyllic, really, when you look at the scope of what childhood can look like. So y'all had no reason to think that any switch had been flipped in him just from that needing a pain medication because of a terrible break. So there's just no change that you could visibly notice in him.
No, I mean, he lettered in every sport he played. He went to college on the Hope Scholarship. So there were no red flags. He went to church with us on Sunday. Both of our kids did, but even in high school, sister away at college, he went with us. He did mission trips, So for us, his friends were focused and ready to go off to college, and there were no red flags. So we really didn't take it that seriously, or I didn't. In the beginning, I thought, he just doesn't take OxyContin again. You can live without that. And we called Ron Greer and to ask him, where do we go from here? At the time, Ron really said, I don't really know what to do.
And I think that's key too, with the One Lamb initiative, if we can just tie that in real quick here, is that one of the first places that people turn when they have issues like this, addiction, and other mental health issues, is to people that they are close to, that they trust and feel like they have their confidence. And for us, that's what we did. I remember calling Ron at one evening right after we learned, and asking him, what to do. And I called two people. I called Ron, and he suggested a therapist that he knew here in Atlanta. And then I called the gentleman at Mohawk that ran our HR department about, where should I take him, hospital or doctor or what? And he recommended that we take him to Emory and take him to the emergency room. Ron gave us, a therapist to go to. And so, our first experience in the healthcare system with treatment for addicts was in the emergency room at Emory. And it was handled really, based on today's standards, very poorly.
It's almost barbaric what they suggested.
They, suggested either he could go into the psych ward, or we could take him home and he could detox there. And they gave us some kind of vague explanations about what to expect with the detox. And, Karen stayed up with him during the whole process. And it was a horrendous experience.
48 hours of just your worst nightmare. And
so you did this with no
okay, I'll have you this.
Oh, right.
Yeah. You could die from what we went through. He could have died during this process. And I just stayed there in the basement with him. We had a TV down there, and I just thought maybe we can just stream some shows or, just get lost in the mindless activity of just watching TV. And he was just sweating. And then he would be throwing up. And then he would go through convulsions. And then his whole body would be like this. It was exactly what you had seen on TV, like when they would, in movies or something, when someone was detoxing. And I'm looking at my sweet boy thinking, how did this happen to him? How did this happen to us? And eventually, he finished it. It was out of his system. And then it was just beginning.
Yeah, we had a steep learning curve, understanding addiction and the impact on the addict and the impact on the rest of the family. I think, as you mentioned early on, it really is a family disease. And it took us a little bit of time to kind of get a lot of time to get our arms around that whole process, what it meant for him, what it meant for Karen and myself, and for his sister, who had just a year or so earlier, a couple of years earlier, had gotten married. If we look at what we did back then, 12 years ago, and the guidance that we were given with Stephen, and what we knew then, and probably what the profession, the addiction treatment profession knew then, compared to what they know now, advise now, it is so different.
We're amazed our son lived.
They would have never, said, take him home and let him detox. We sent him to an outpatient program. We lived at the time in Ansley Park, and we sent him in Atlanta, and we sent him to an outpatient program up in Roswell. And it just kept getting worse, and he was in 12-step programs.
Seeing a therapist.
Going to meetings and seeing a therapist. And what we've come to learn is that the cravings for that drug are so strong. It is extremely difficult for the people that are using to be able to withstand that and stay sober. And we had him in after that outpatient clinic. We probably had him in another 3 or 4 different treatment centers before we finally settled on one that worked. But he went to his first residential treatment, meaning he was there 24/7 up in Tennessee. And a girl that he had met in a 12-step program that they connected, and she went up and took him out before it was time. And I think that was when we told him that
just before she did pick him up, but we received a phone call from this treatment center, like every treatment center he had been in, and that dreaded phone call. He's just not cooperating. This is not working. He is not responsive to anything, and so he's out of the program. So, like Frank said, this was our 3rd or 4th treatment center, and we really wanted this to work. And we received a phone call saying he is not cooperating. He says he's cured and he wants to come home. And we think we need to have an intervention with the family. And like I said, like Frank said, our daughter had recently been married, and her husband felt like, I don't know the family well enough to do something so personal. So it was just the 3 of us, our daughter, and Frank and myself, and we had an intervention while he was still in treatment, and with the counselors there. And he was almost unrecognizable in his conversation, in his threats, that he was okay. Why are you doing this to me? And our daughter was just sobbing. This is not anything that she had ever encountered in her brother. And I remember she was just crying and screaming, "Stephen, please listen." And the counselor that we were talking to that was guiding us through this, she says, "You need to be prepared. You just don't say, well, we'll think about it." An intervention means we're going to have a cutoff. And that cutoff means he is not welcome in your life anymore. And for addicts, that means homelessness. Are you prepared to put your child on the streets? And I asked the counselor, okay, if he goes to the streets, he may use. And so what you're telling me is that in all likelihood, our son is not going to make it. He will probably overdose and die. The chance of recovery for heroin addiction is less than 5%. So I said, okay, tell me which moms do the best. Do they do better if they die on the streets or in their childhood bed? And she said, on the streets. It's devastating when you go into their room and you find them dead in their bed. And you feel guilty because you provided that bed. You provided the food, the shelter for them. But if they chose to live on the streets, that's by their choice. And it's easier to get over. The guilt is not there, as if you allowed them to come back into your home. Okay, that's what we're going to do. I thought I'd never have to make this kind of decision, but if this is the cards we've been dealt, then this gives us at least less guilt in the decision. And then that's what he chose. He chose that. The girlfriend came and picked him up. And it didn't take long for the two of them, both heroin addicts. He was living under a bridge on Spring Street for 9 weeks. We tried everything. He would occasionally call us, and he threatened everything. Of course, he was going to kill himself. He threatened prostitution. If you don't do this, then I'm going to prostitute myself. And those were hard conversations to hear and to not give in to. But at some point, I think Frank and I, we were just sitting together. We'd become weakened versions of ourselves and just so tired and exhausted. And I said, he may never recover. I think you and I need to recover. And so I called Betty Ford, and I said, do you have a program for the parents of an addict, the loved one of an addict? And they said, yes, we do. We will teach you how to recover if Stephen never recovers. And that's what we did. We went to Betty Ford.
Yes, we went out to Palm Springs without Stephen. They have a family week out there periodically primarily for the patients and their families, but then they would also invite family members in that didn't have patients there. And we went out to the desert, and I think it was in the middle of the summer. It was pretty hot. But
no, it was October the 3rd.
It was hot.
But in the desert. Yeah. It's still hot.
That's
I love that you can remember the exact.
Oh, I remember dates. I remember the date we went in and then lead up to the date that Steve.
So we were there it's a week-long, 5-day program, and they would do a great job with it. And that's probably, we had already been to 12-step Al-Anon type 12-step or Nar-Anon type 12-step programs before that, but this one really kind of put things in perspective and explain the disease to you, that it's it is a disease, and it's like having diabetes. You can't cure it It's a chronic disease, but it can be treated, and it can be treated successfully. And they had a lot of, besides just sharing the facts, a lot of success stories that they shared with us, and a lot of them were multiple visits to the rehab center. And, one guy said, I don't know why it took me 5 times of watching a video, but, 5 times after that, it worked. And so, well, that really gave us hope, where before we really didn't have much. But Stephen was still out on the streets. And, I'll never forget. So when you went in through a gate, and they had a guard there. And then I think, well, no, they didn't take your phones. You had to leave your phones in the car, but you couldn't take your phones inside the building. So you'd be in there for 8 or 10 hours, and we'd come back, and on the way to the hotel, we'd check our messages. And on the last day we were there, coming out, Karen checked her phone messages, and we had told Stephen before this, when he was still on the streets, we said, look, if you want to go into rehab, you've got these 3 choices. One was Hazleton, that was before they merged with Betty Ford. The other was Betty Ford, and the third I can't remember.
I think it's Karen down in Florida.
He had all of these, like, I'd like to go out in the Caribbean, for this.
Eric Clapton has a famous recovery center in the Caribbean. So he had all these just very bohemian ways of recovery. But the last day that we were there, you're given a group. And probably about 20 people were in your group. And that last day, the family member has a conversation with the addict, the alcoholic, whoever's there. This is gut-wrenching. They put 2 chairs in the center of the group, and we're all watching. I mean, it was just heartbreaking. You're out of the will. You can never see your grandchildren again, mother. You're just saying how this addiction has impacted the family members and what it feels like to be an addict or an alcoholic. And you just want to embrace these suffering individuals. And so the last day, I was like, thank goodness Stephen's not here. I couldn't do this. And so everyone had gone, and he said, it's now your turn, Karen. And again, this is California. I thought, this is so crazy. Stephen's not here. And they said, so they put 2 chairs. I sat there, and it was surprisingly quiet. And I thought, how can I even say anything to this empty chair? But the counselor said, what does Stephen look like? We know what our loved ones look like. Tell us what Stephen. I said, he's about 6'1", blonde hair, brown eyes. He kind of dresses preppy. And then the group got quiet. And what would he be wearing? And I said, probably blue jeans, a white button-down shirt, maybe sneakers. And one thing led to the next, and I could see him there. And I could hear people in the group crying. Because and on some level, he was there. And I told him how much he meant to me, what I missed about him. This is nothing a parent ever, thought you would do this, but this would be our journey. And anyway, I said it, and I felt better. It was, on some level, I just felt better. And he had told us it was Frank's birthday, and he had called us or something, and we said, why don't you come out to dinner with us? And he looked really bad when he joined us that night. But he did, and he kept quiet and kind of like this, the dinner and all of that. And we told him, we're going to Betty Ford. And he says, I'm never doing that. And I said, we're going for ourselves. And he said, well, okay, I'm not going to do that. I said, that's okay, Stephen. We want to get better. We want to recover. And so when we came back that Friday afternoon, I checked my messages. It was from Stephen. I'm coming to Betty Ford. So he was kind of in a dangerous situation, and Frank had to get him out. I don't want to go into all of that, but we got him out, and we had to go to Betty Ford. So I took him. He came in. He was using that night. And that morning, Frank took a picture of us. I had been up all night long. There was a threatening element to this. I thought it might come visit us at the house that night. I couldn't sleep. Someone tried to get him, and so he was using all night long and dressed when I got on the plane. And he smokes. So I didn't realize at airports there's these smoking stations. So I got the tickets, and he was smoking, and they were boarding, and Stephen was nowhere to be found. So at the last minute, Stephen got on the plane with me, and we did this again. We had a layover in Salt Lake City, I think. Again, the smoking thing, barely got on the plane. Again, the second time. So we made it to Betty Ford. And I didn't realize the process of this, but they meet you with a van because they know anyone coming to Betty Ford, they may not make it to Betty Ford if you get a taxi or whatever. So they bring a professional to pick you up, and there were quite a few in the van. We literally stopped at bridges, we stopped in liquor stores, and we picked up the drunks, the drug addicts, all going to Betty Ford. And like he said, when he opened that gate to go in with the van, and they opened the doors, and literally everyone in the van ran out except for Stephen. And they were running in the parking lot. Their loved one was running after them. And they were just, I can't do this. I can't do this. I'm not ready. I'm not ready. And Stephen and I were the first ones to get on the van. So we were on the last row. And Stephen and I were just in shock watching all these people running around the parking lot, crying and screaming. And he grabbed my hand and he said, let's go. And he walked in. And I would love to say, everything was wonderful. We had family week at Thanksgiving.
Yeah, he was there.
9 months.
He went through different phases, and he went to this final phase. It was a bit like sober living, which is where you have a home, and you have a person that is in charge, and they have addicts there, and it's kind of a transition from residential treatment to the real world. But this one was one step kind of below that before you actually went out into the world. And so we thought the longer the better, get those drugs out of his mind, his brain, his body, and the longer you have him in rehab, the more likely he's going to be successful in his recovery. And then, after he finished his 9 months there, we found a place for him in San Diego. Mohawk had a facility there, and so I was able to get him a job. And we found a sober living home for him. And he was there for a month or two, and then from there he found a roommate to go out on his own. And from all we could tell, the roommate was just he wasn't an addict. He was just a normal 20-year-old guy. And we found out within a month or two that his roommate was kicking him out because he was using again. And so we went through a period of, months, I guess. It seemed like years, but months where he was, we finally got him connected with a therapist. And Stephen, meanwhile, was kind of in and out of different outpatient programs out there in San Diego. And when this therapist got involved with his last relapse, and at the time, Stephen was living with the lady that would become his wife, who is a sober person. Our therapist called us. He couldn't, because of confidentiality, tell us, but he said, you need to talk to Stephen. Dr. A, can you tell me what it's about? No, you just need to call him right now. And we found out later that he had told Stephen, you need to tell your parents that, you're in a bad way right now. And so Stephen did. And Dr. A said, well, you need to send him back to Betty Ford for a second time. And this was around October, November again, I guess. And, he was still continuing to use throughout all of this. And his girlfriend agreed to drive him out there. It's not something she had signed up for, but she agreed to drive him out there, which was about a couple-hour drive from San Diego. And so he went in for the second time, and it was real discouraging then. He'd been in what we thought was one of the top 5 recovery centers, treatment programs in the country. It didn't work. And, it's back to that, the cravings are just so strong. It's very difficult for people.
1,000 times greater than alcohol.
So
that's why the chance of surviving.
One of the things that we learned, because we started supporting Betty Ford financially after his first stint there, and we had a doctor that was working at Betty Ford that visited us and talked about medication-assisted treatment, which was new to us and new to 12-step programs as well. And this was right after Hazelton and Betty Ford had merged. Hazelton had already embraced this medication-assisted treatment, and Betty Ford was kind of in the process as a result of the merger of doing that. So the people there in Southern California didn't have much of an understanding about it. So we called Andy Mendenhall, who had talked to us, Dr. Andy Mendenhall, who had talked to us about, the program and maybe some fundraising related to it, because nobody at Betty Ford had even knew about it. And so we called him up, and he said, yeah, he needs to go on Suboxone. As we learned later, that it's a medication that has a small amount of opioid in it, and it suppresses the cravings that the addict has and allows them to kind of start functioning a more normal life. It does not to say you don't have to continue with, going to 12-step meetings or some sort of group therapy as well as individual therapy, but it really helps on the craving side. And, it's something that I think also over time that the medical profession has come to kind of view as the gold standard for opioid addiction. And we signed him up for that. And even with that, it was a little rocky road for the first few months. But Stephen, fortunately, is sober now for
It's going on 7 years.
7 years.
But
he took the medication for 5 of those years, I believe, and he was able to kind of get his life back on track, start to feel more normal again.
Finished college.
And he would ask him, well, does it make you feel high or anything? He said, no, it just makes me feel normal so I can function. And he ended up marrying the girl that he was living with. They unfortunately have divorced since, but they're all fine from that right now. And started a business, a vintage retail clothing business in San Diego. So, long story short, or maybe a long story, not quite as long, but he right now is, he's got another girlfriend that he's with. He has a business that's successful, and he's living on his own. We're not sending money, and we get the phone calls, about how he's doing and how the business is doing, and how his relationships are doing, and so it feels very normal now. But I would say, if I were to look at his success and why he was successful and so many others weren't, we went to a lot of funerals for friends, kids that were in our confirmation classes.
Yes.
But I would say it would be his therapist that he had, who he still has now, the medication that he has, and I just think the overall success he has now in life with his own business, that he built and that he runs and that is profitable now.
I'm just going to add to this. When you started with that Stephen came to y'all, I think college, and said, I have an addiction, which is really exceptional. Most college students have no idea they have any problems, much less would come to their parents with an addiction. And also, it seems to me that y'all provided a pathway to connection, even in the midst of the worst of the worst of the worst situations. The connectivity never left. And I have to guess that that's why when y'all were on that van, he all of a sudden saw the people scattering to disconnect, and he realized that he had something remarkable in your family unit that maybe other people that aren't as successful don't have.
Yeah, I think he recognized that, and he would say this now, that there's nothing in his family life or things that we did that caused him to become an addict. And I think the other point that he would make is that we continue to support him through a couple of years of when he was bouncing in and out of different treatment programs. I do think too that this points out advantages that people of means have. They can send their loved ones to these treatment programs that are not cheap, where others that are less fortunate from the underserved communities don't necessarily have those same advantages. I'm not sure where he would be if we weren't able to have paid for all those treatment programs like we did.
You're exactly right. And a lot of debate around public policy and insurance, and the fact that mental wellness and addiction aren't covered the same way that diabetes and cancer are. So before we end, you've taken what is a tragic and difficult segment of your life, and a large segment of your life, but you've taken that and done, I think, exactly what God hopes we will do, is to take an unfortunate, terrible situation and use it for good. So will you talk for just a minute about your work with the Addiction Alliance?
Sure, yeah. Karen and I, as I had mentioned, were supporting different charities before this, and I remember coming up, giving money to our school, and she said, "Look, I don't want to give money anymore unless it has something to do with addiction treatment, education, and recovery."
For Atlanta.
And so, and one of the things that we were always focused on, because we felt such a strong attachment to Betty Ford, was to figure out a way to get Betty Ford here in Atlanta. I mean, why should people have to send their loved ones all the way across country for good treatment programs? I mean, we've got some of the best healthcare in the country here in Atlanta, right? With Emory and Shepherd Center and the CDC. But then you have to send somebody thousands of miles away to a good treatment program. Just didn't make any sense. And so I decided that we started supporting some of the work that Hazelton Betty Ford then was doing down here in Atlanta. And I decided, it was close to retirement from Mohawk, but while I still had some, a little bit of a bully pulpit, if you will, as a CFO within the business community, to at least raise awareness about addiction, and then hopefully raise some money. And then, kind of in the back of my mind, I thought, well, maybe there's a chance we can get Hazelton Betty Ford to come here. But we'd already asked, and they'd said no. And so I went and talked with a number of different people. Finally, someone pointed me to Tom Johnson, who is the former CEO of CNN. And Tom had always been very involved with mental health issues, and was a tremendous fundraiser. And I'll never forget, in 2018, going into the OK Cafe February morning and telling Tom the story. And I had the pitch down well. And he said, okay, well, what do you want me to do? And I said, well, it'd be nice if you could, in this little project we had going on at the time, I said, if you could help with this. He said, well, why don't we just get Betty Ford down here? I said, well, that would be great, I didn't know at the time that he was very close to the Moyers family. He was in the White House when Bill Moyers was in the White House. And their son, William Moyers, I think as you know, is a recovering addict. So he was very well connected to Hazelton Betty Ford. And so one thing led to the other, and it took a while to get the institutions together, but we were able to form a partnership between Emory Healthcare and Hazelton Betty Ford. It's called the Addiction Alliance of Georgia, and basically to address addiction, not just here in Atlanta, but around the state. It's hard for us to get treatment here in Atlanta, but think about somebody in South Georgia or Northwest Georgia. It is really difficult. So we had the ribbon cutting about a year ago. It's up and running. It right now has outpatient treatment. We have a component of it that is addressing education across every aspect that you could imagine. Families, communities, the healthcare profession. There's a tremendous amount of stigma associated, as you know, with addiction, but you wouldn't expect it to be in the healthcare community. It is. And then with a lot of the 12-step programs, there's stigma associated with that and whether or not you're really sober if you're using MAT to stay sober. And so there's the education component and then a research component. There's a lot of, those two entities have a lot of data and a lot of scientists that can kind of put that together, and maybe we can come up with more medications that can treat different types of addictions. So like I said, it's been up and running now for going on a year, and has been successful so far. And we're looking forward to hopefully the next phase and building a residential treatment center here and expanding on the other two components of the program with research and education.
That would be great. My husband has to take statins, not because of anything other than the fact that he naturally produces too much cholesterol.
Yeah.
And I think what you're talking about here is there's a drug that will help you if your body is naturally drawn to addiction from opioids. I mean, it's just an A plus B equals C situation, and hopefully with the work you're doing, we'll start to see it as just a scientific equation that we need to help people through,
Yeah. Well, that's our prayer and our hope, is that we can get people. I think the biggest issue right now with any kind of addiction is the stigma. People don't want to talk about it, and we need to do something to get rid of that stigma and to address it just like any other disease, how we think about it and how we treat it. And look at all the different alternatives.
That's great. Well, I really appreciate your coming, and I've never heard you tell the whole story before, and I'm just really touched. I actually have 3 young adults / teenagers. So the minute this gets aired, I'm make sure they see this. So in closing, we are very grateful to the Boykins for talking to One Lamb and the Peachtree Road congregation and the larger congregation and community about what has been a heart-wrenching, difficult, and yet hopeful story and journey for their family. It's not one that is unfamiliar to most families, and we appreciate your willingness to be honest and transparent in an effort to help all of us as we grapple with addiction and alcoholism and other mental wellness issues. And as I always close these videos and say, our biggest goal at Peachtree Road with the One Lamb Ministry is normalizing the congregation and the conversation around mental wellness issues so that we can recognize that we are all susceptible and we need to be loving and supportive as a community of faith as people grapple with these things. Thank you.